In the harsh winter of 1885, a pregnant widow arrived in Silver Hollow with nothing but fabric scraps and a heart full of purpose. Delilah Grace Monroe had lost everything, her husband, her home, her future, but when she discovered 23 orphaned children shivering in rags at the town's forgotten orphanage, she found something worth fighting for. Working by candlelight in a cramped boarding house room, Delilah began sewing clothes for every child, trading her handiwork for bread and shelter. Her needle became her weapon against despair, her thread a lifeline of hope. She poured her grief into every stitch, transforming scraps into dignity. Then wealthy rancher Beau Langston witnessed something that changed everything, Delilah kneeling in the snow, gently fitting a warm coat on a barefoot child. In that moment, her selfless love awakened something long dormant in his guarded heart. But would her generosity cost her everything, including the chance at love she never saw coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The storm that had revealed the children's desperate situation raged for 3 days, and during those 3 days, Delilah established a routine that would define the weeks to come. She rose before dawn each morning to begin sewing, worked through the day with only brief breaks for meals, and continued by lamplight well into the evening. Her fingers grew stiff from the constant motion, her back ached from hunching over her machine, but she pressed on with the determination of a woman who had found her calling. She started with 3-year-old Peter, the smallest of the children, whose need was most urgent. The coat she designed for him was forest green wool with a warm flannel lining, sized to allow for growth but fitted enough to actually keep him warm. She added careful details that would matter to a child, wooden buttons carved to look like tiny animals, pockets just the right size for small treasures, and reinforced knees because little boys would be little boys, even in orphanages. When the storm finally broke and she could safely travel to the orphanage, Peter's reaction to his new coat was everything she had hoped for. The little boy ran his hands over the soft wool with wonder, then hugged the coat to his chest before allowing Tommy to help him put it on. When he realized the buttons were carved animals, he squealed with delight, naming each one as he fastened them. "Look, Tommy, a rabbit and a squirrel, and this one's a bear." His joy was infectious, and soon all the children were gathered around, examining the carved buttons with the same reverence usually reserved for precious gems. "Where did these come from?" Matron Crenshaw asked, running her finger over the intricate carving on one of the buttons. "Tommy made them," Delilah explained, smiling at the boy's surprised expression. "I noticed his woodworking skills and asked if he'd help with the coats. He's quite talented." Tommy's face flushed with pride. Since his parents' death, few adults had noticed his abilities, let alone praised them. To be included as a partner in this project, rather than simply a recipient of charity, was transformative for the serious 8-year-old. "I can make more," he offered eagerly. "Different animals for each coat. Maybe birds for the girls." "That would be perfect," Delilah agreed, and the partnership was born. As word of Delilah's project began to spread through Silver Hollow, reactions were mixed. Some, like Mrs. Patterson at the general store, offered quiet support, setting aside remnants and selling fabric to Delilah at cost. Others, particularly among the town council members, seemed to view her efforts with suspicion, as if caring too much about the orphans somehow reflected poorly on their own indifference. But the most unexpected reaction came on the morning Delilah discovered a package outside her boarding house door. She had risen early as usual, intending to begin work on Mary's coat, a complicated project since the 11-year-old was nearly grown and needed something more sophisticated than the simple design suitable for the younger children. But when she opened her door to retrieve the milk Mrs. Henley left each morning, she found a brown paper parcel tied with string sitting on the threshold. Inside was the most beautiful bolt of blue wool she had ever seen. It was expensive material, soft as butter and deep as winter sky, with enough yardage to make at least 2 full coats. There was no note, no indication of who had left it, just the fabric and a small bag containing matching thread and what appeared to be silver buttons of exceptional quality. "Mrs. Henley," Delilah called, hurrying to the kitchen with the mysterious package. "Did you see who left this?" The older woman examined the fabric with an appreciative eye. "That's fine wool, finer than anything Henderson stocks at the general store. Someone with means left that for you. But who? And why wouldn't they identify themselves?" Mrs. Henley shrugged, but there was a knowing glint in her eye that suggested she might have suspicions she wasn't sharing. Maybe they don't want to be thanked. Some folks prefer to do their good deeds quietly. The mystery of the anonymous benefactor intrigued Delilah, but she had too much work to spend long wondering about it. The blue wool was perfect for the older children who needed more mature-looking garments, and she set to work immediately on Mary's coat, designing it with the dignity appropriate for a girl approaching womanhood. As she worked, she found herself thinking about the person who had left such an expensive gift. It had to be someone with considerable means. The fabric alone was worth more than most people in Silver Hollow earned in a month. It also had to be someone who knew about her project and cared enough to want to help. The list of possibilities was short in a town the size of Silver Hollow. Meanwhile, across town, Beau Langston was dealing with his own complicated feelings about the mysterious package he'd left in the pre-dawn darkness. He told himself it was simply practical. He had business interests in Silver Hollow, and having happy, healthy children around was better for everyone. He certainly wasn't getting emotionally involved in the situation, but the truth was more complex. Since Miguel had mentioned seeing the pregnant widow at the orphanage, Beau had found himself paying more attention to the talk around town. He'd heard about her promise to make coats for all the children, about her long hours spent sewing, about the way she was pouring her limited resources into an impossible task. Something about her selflessness stirred memories he'd tried to bury. His sister Emma had been 8 when their parents died, leaving them both orphaned. Beau had been 16, old enough to work but not old enough to care for a child properly. He'd made the practical decision to place Emma in an orphanage back east while he worked to build something stable for both of them. It had taken him 3 years to establish himself well enough to send for her. 3 years during which he'd received fewer and fewer letters from a little girl who was slowly losing hope. When he'd finally traveled east to retrieve her, he'd found Emma's grave in the orphanage cemetery. She'd died of pneumonia the previous winter, alone and forgotten while he'd been building his fortune. The guilt of that failure had shaped every decision he'd made since. He'd learned to keep his emotions carefully controlled, to view relationships as transactions, to never again let sentiment override practical judgment. It had made him wealthy and successful, but it had also made him solitary. Watching Delilah pour herself into caring for children who weren't even her own awakened something uncomfortable in him, a longing for the kind of courage she displayed so naturally, the ability to love without counting the cost. The blue wool was his compromise. He could help without getting involved, contribute without caring too much. At least, that's what he told himself as he rode past the boarding house each morning, hoping for a glimpse of progress on her impossible project. Back at the orphanage, the children had begun to view Delilah's daily visits with excitement rather than the resigned politeness they'd shown before. Her presence brought not only the promise of warm clothing, but also the attention they'd been starved for. She learned their names, their histories, their small dreams and fears. There was David, who collected smooth stones and dreamed of building a real house someday. Sarah, who could recite entire poems from memory and made up songs about the birds outside her window. 12-year-old Catherine, who helped care for the youngest children with a maternal instinct that broke Delilah's heart. Each child became precious to her, each personality a bright thread in the tapestry of her purpose. As she fitted Mary for her blue wool coat, listening to the girl's shy questions about what it was like to be married and have a real home, Delilah felt the baby move restlessly inside her. Soon she would have her own child to love and protect. But these children, abandoned, forgotten, surviving on scraps of kindness, had claimed a permanent place in her heart. Whatever happened after her baby was born, she would not abandon this mission. The coats were just the beginning. As evening fell and she packed up her sewing supplies to return to the boarding house, Tommy approached with a small carved button in his palm. "For your baby," he said shyly, "when it's born, I made it special." The button was carved in the shape of a star, smooth and perfect, with tiny points that caught the lamplight. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever made for her unborn child, and Delilah felt tears spring to her eyes. "Thank you, Tommy," she whispered, closing her fingers around the precious gift. "This will be treasured always." As she walked back down the hill in the gathering darkness, the carved star safe in her pocket and the mystery of the blue wool still unsolved, Delilah felt a deep contentment despite her exhaustion. She was making a difference, one stitch at a time, one small life at a time. And somewhere in the shadows of Silver Hollow, a lonely rancher watched her progress with growing admiration and a heart that was slowly, carefully beginning to thaw. Over the following weeks, Delilah's daily visits to the orphanage became the highlight of not just the children's days, but her own. Each morning brought new progress, another coat completed, another child fitted, another small miracle of transformation as forgotten children rediscovered their worth through the simple dignity of warm, beautiful clothing. Tommy had become her invaluable partner, his wood-carving skills growing more sophisticated with each set of buttons he created. For 6-year-old Sarah's rose-colored coat, he carved delicate flowers. For 10-year-old Michael's brown wool jacket, he fashioned buttons that looked like tiny shields, perfect for a boy who dreamed of adventures. The children began requesting specific designs, and Tommy rose to each challenge with the determined concentration of a true artisan. "You should teach the other children," Delilah suggested one afternoon as she watched him carefully sand a button shaped like a crescent moon for little Beth's cream-colored coat. "Share your skills. Some of the older boys might enjoy learning woodworking." Tommy looked up from his work, his dark eyes brightening at the suggestion. "You think they'd want to learn? Really?" "I think everyone wants to feel useful," Delilah replied gently, "and everyone has something valuable to contribute." The woodworking lessons became another daily ritual. Tommy, usually shy and withdrawn, blossomed into a patient teacher, guiding the older boys through the basics of carving, while the younger children watched with fascination. Even 12-year-old James, who'd arrived at the orphanage angry and defensive after his father's mining accident, found peace in the rhythmic motion of shaping wood. But it was Catherine, the maternal 12-year-old who helped care for the youngest children, who surprised everyone by showing the most natural talent for the craft. Her small hands proved remarkably steady, and her artistic eye led to button designs of unusual beauty. "Girls can carve too," she declared when some of the boys initially questioned her participation. "Mrs. Monroe sews, and that's skilled work. I don't see why I can't carve." Delilah smiled as she watched Catherine shape a button into a perfect rose. "Indeed you can, sweetheart. Skill belongs to anyone willing to learn." The children's growing confidence and sense of purpose didn't go unnoticed by the adults in Silver Hollow. Mrs. Patterson mentioned to several customers how well-behaved the orphans had become during their weekly trips to the general store. Dr. Henderson noted that they seemed healthier, standing straighter, speaking more clearly. Even stern Miss Caldwell, who ran the bank, grudgingly admitted that the children appeared more civilized when he encountered them on the street. But not everyone approved of the changes. Councilman Rogers, a thin man with suspicious eyes and a perpetually sour expression, cornered Delilah outside Henderson's store one gray December morning. "Mrs. Monroe, isn't it?" he said, blocking her path with deliberate rudeness. "I understand you've been spending considerable time at the orphanage." "Yes, sir," Delilah replied evenly, shifting her package of newly purchased fabric to a more comfortable position. "Some folks are wondering about your motivations," Rogers continued, his tone implying something unsavory. "A woman in your condition, alone, taking such an unusual interest in other people's children. It raises questions." Delilah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but her voice remained calm. "The only question that should matter, Mr. Rogers, is why it took an outsider to notice that 23 children were facing winter without proper clothing." Rogers' face reddened. "Now see here, those children are the territory's responsibility, not. Those children are everyone's responsibility," Delilah interrupted, her patience finally fraying. "They're human beings, not inconvenient problems to be ignored. If caring about their welfare raises questions about my character, then I'm proud to be questionable." She stepped around him and continued toward the boarding house, leaving Rogers sputtering behind her. But the encounter left her shaken. She'd encountered similar attitudes in Denver, the assumption that a woman who cared too much about other people's children must have something wrong with her, some hidden agenda or personal failing. That afternoon, as she worked on David's forest green coat, her hands trembled slightly as she guided the fabric through her machine. The baby moved restlessly inside her, perhaps sensing her agitation, and she had to stop several times to rest. Mrs. Henley found her sitting by her window, staring out at the grey December sky with unusual melancholy. "What's troubling you, dear?" the older woman asked, settling into the chair beside Delilah's sewing table. Delilah recounted her encounter with Councilman Rogers, and Mrs. Henley's expression grew stern. "Harold Rogers is a small man who likes to make others feel small too," she said firmly. "Don't let his narrow mind diminish what you're doing. Half the town is talking about how those children have changed since you started working with them." "Changed how?" "They smile now," Mrs. Henley said simply. "They walk with their heads up. Yesterday I saw young Tommy helping old Mrs. Macready carry her groceries, and Sarah was singing while she swept the orphanage steps." Those children have hope now, and hope changes everything. That evening, as if to prove Mrs. Henley's point, Delilah discovered another mysterious package outside her door. This time it contained not just fabric, but also a collection of beautiful ribbons, lace trim, and pearl buttons that would add elegant touches to the girls' coats. Again, there was no note, no indication of the benefactor's identity. "Someone's watching your work very carefully," Mrs. Henley observed when Delilah showed her the gifts. "These additions show real thought about what would make the children's coats special." Delilah fingered the delicate lace, wondering again about her anonymous supporter. The gifts were too thoughtful to be random charity, too perfectly suited to her needs to be coincidental. Someone was paying close attention to her project, understanding not just the practical requirements but the emotional importance of making each child feel valued. The mystery deepened 2 days later when she encountered Beau Langston at Henderson's store. She was examining wool fabric, calculating how much she could afford for the remaining coats, when a deep voice behind her said, "The blue would suit a young girl better than the brown." Delilah turned to find herself facing a tall man with dark hair touched by silver at the temples and eyes the color of storm clouds. He was impeccably dressed despite the rural setting, and there was something in his bearing that spoke of authority and success. "I'm sorry," she said, not understanding his comment. "The fabric," he clarified, gesturing toward the bolts she'd been examining. "You were deciding between the blue and the brown. For children's clothing, blue is more versatile. You seem to know something about children's clothing, Mr. Langston, Beau Langston." "And I know very little about children's clothing," he admitted with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "But I know quite a bit about practical considerations." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, and Delilah found herself studying his face. There was something guarded about his expression, but also something indefinably sad, as if he carried old grief carefully hidden beneath his composed exterior. "You're the woman who's been making coats for the orphans," he said finally, and it wasn't a question. "Word travels quickly in a small town," Delilah replied. "Good news travels especially quickly. So does gossip, unfortunately. I hope you're not letting narrow minds discourage important work." The comment was perceptive enough to make her wonder if he'd heard about her encounter with Councilman Rogers. "Important work? Caring for forgotten children is always important work," Beau said simply. "My compliments on your dedication, Mrs. Monroe." He touched his hat politely and moved away before she could respond, leaving Delilah staring after him with growing curiosity. Beau Langston had a reputation in Silver Hollow as a successful but distant man, someone who kept to himself and avoided community entanglements. Yet he'd spoken about her work with genuine respect, and there had been something in his eyes when he mentioned forgotten children that suggested personal understanding. That night, as she worked on the delicate trim for Catherine's coat, using the mysterious lace that had appeared at her door, Delilah found herself thinking about the encounter. Beau Langston was clearly a man of means, and his comment about practical considerations suggested familiarity with quality materials. Could he be her anonymous benefactor? The thought intrigued her more than it should have. There had been something compelling about his grave courtesy, the way he'd spoken with authority about children's needs despite claiming no expertise, and those storm-grey eyes had held depths she found herself wanting to explore. She shook her head at her own foolishness. She was a pregnant widow with a mission to complete, not a woman free to indulge in romantic speculation about enigmatic ranchers. Whatever Beau Langston's story might be, her focus needed to remain on the children who depended on her. But as she worked late into the night, adding delicate touches to Catherine's coat that would make the girl feel beautiful and valued, Delilah couldn't quite shake the memory of grey eyes that seemed to understand more than their owner was willing to reveal. And in the back of her mind, a small voice wondered if the mysterious gifts and the chance encounter might be connected in ways that could change everything. The weeks that followed Delilah's encounter with Beau Langston brought an unexpected shift in the rhythm of her days. The mysterious packages continued to appear with increasing frequency, but now they seemed tailored to her specific needs with an almost uncanny precision. When she ran short of red thread while working on 8-year-old Anna's coat, a spool appeared overnight. When she mentioned to Tommy that she wished she had warmer lining material for the littlest children's garments, fine flannel materialized at her door the next morning. It was this last gift that prompted her to test a growing suspicion. That evening, as she settled into her sewing routine, she casually mentioned to Mrs. Henley that she would need dark green wool for 14-year-old Robert's coat, a specific shade she'd seen at Henderson's but couldn't afford. "Dark green is a good choice for a boy his age," Mrs. Henley agreed, "practical and handsome." "Yes, but that particular wool costs more than I can manage right now. I may have to settle for something less suitable." Mrs. Henley nodded sympathetically, but Delilah caught a knowing glint in the older woman's eye that confirmed her suspicions.
Someone was listening to her conversations, and that someone had both the means and the inclination to provide exactly what she needed. Sure enough, the next morning brought not just the dark green wool, but also buttons that perfectly complemented the fabric and thread in precisely the right shade. Delilah stood in her doorway, holding the materials and smiling despite herself. Her anonymous benefactor was either remarkably prescient or remarkably well-informed about her daily activities. The question was no longer whether Beau Langston was involved, but why he chose to help in such a secretive manner. A man of his standing in the community could easily make a public donation, earning gratitude and social recognition. The fact that he preferred anonymity suggested something more personal was at stake. Her curiosity was satisfied, quite by accident, 3 days later. She had been working late on Robert's coat, struggling with a particularly difficult seam, when her lamp began to flicker ominously. The oil was running low, and she realized with dismay that she'd forgotten to purchase more during her trip to Henderson's that afternoon. With a sigh, she set aside her work and prepared to continue in the morning. But as she moved to extinguish the dying lamp, she noticed a figure on horseback stopped in the street below her window. Even in the dim light, she recognized the silhouette immediately. Beau Langston sat motionless on his horse, looking up at her lit window with an expression she couldn't quite decipher from that distance. For a long moment, they simply observed each other across the darkness. Then Beau touched his hat in a respectful salute and rode away, disappearing into the night as quietly as he'd come. The next morning, Delilah found a fresh supply of lamp oil outside her door, along with a note written in strong masculine handwriting, for the important work that continues long after others have retired. She held the note for a long time, reading and rereading the simple words. They revealed more than Beau probably intended. Not just that he was indeed her mysterious benefactor, but that he'd been watching her work, understanding the sacrifice it required, the long hours spent in solitude while others slept. The realization should have embarrassed her, but instead it filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the winter sun streaming through her window. Someone understood. Someone saw not just the finished coats that drew praise from the community, but the midnight hours of labor, the aching fingers, the determination required to continue when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her purpose. That afternoon, when she encountered Beau again at Henderson's store, she felt no surprise, only a quiet sense of inevitability. "Mr. Langston," she said, approaching him near the counter where he was conducting business with the storekeeper. He turned, and she was struck again by the guarded intelligence in his grey eyes. "Mrs. Monroe, how are your projects progressing?" "Very well, thanks to some remarkably timely assistance from an unknown benefactor." She watched his face carefully as she spoke, noting the slight tightening around his eyes that confirmed what she already knew. "Silver Hollow has always had generous hearts, even if they're not always visible," he replied carefully. "Indeed. I was hoping to thank this generous heart properly, but anonymous donors are notoriously difficult to locate." A shadow of what might have been amusement crossed Beau's features. "Perhaps the anonymity is intentional. Some people prefer their charity to remain private, and perhaps some people need to understand that gratitude, when genuinely felt, is not a burden to be avoided." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken acknowledgement hanging between them. Finally, Beau cleared his throat and glanced toward the door. "Would you care to join me for coffee, Mrs. Monroe? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Delilah's heart gave an unexpected flutter, but she maintained her composure. "That would be pleasant." They walked to the small cafe attached to the Silver Dollar Hotel, where the proprietor, Mrs. Sullivan, served them coffee and fresh bread, with an expression of barely contained curiosity. It wasn't often that the town's most eligible bachelor was seen in the company of any woman, let alone the pregnant widow who'd been causing such a stir with her orphanage project. "I owe you an explanation," Beau said once they were seated at a corner table, "and perhaps an apology. For your generosity, that seems unnecessary. For the deception, you have a right to know who's been assisting your efforts." Delilah studied his face, noting the way he chose his words carefully, the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested this conversation was more difficult for him than it appeared. "Why the secrecy, Mr. Langston? You could have simply offered to help directly." Beau was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if searching for answers in its dark depths. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more personal than she'd heard it before. "I had a sister once, Emma. She was 8 when our parents died, and I was 16, old enough to work but not old enough to care for a child properly. I thought I was being practical when I placed her in an orphanage back east while I established myself out here." Delilah felt her breath catch at the pain evident in his carefully controlled voice. "I was going to send for her once I had a proper home, enough money to provide for her properly. I sent letters, small gifts when I could afford them. She wrote back at first, sweet letters full of hope and trust that her big brother would come for her soon. He paused, his jaw tightening with old grief. The letters stopped coming after 2 years. When I finally traveled east to bring her home, I found her grave in the orphanage cemetery. She'd died the previous winter. Pneumonia. Alone. "Oh, Beau," Delilah whispered, her heart breaking for the young man who tried to do right and lost everything that mattered. "I've lived with that failure for 17 years, he continued, his eyes fixed on something beyond the cafe walls. "Watching you pour yourself into caring for children who aren't even your own, seeing their faces light up when you walk into that orphanage, it awakened something I thought I'd buried with Emma." He finally met her eyes, and she saw vulnerability there that took her breath away. "I couldn't help directly because I didn't trust myself not to care too much. Anonymous gifts seemed safer, less complicated."
Delilah reached across the table and placed her hand gently over his. "Caring isn't a failure, Beau. It's what makes us human. Caring killed my sister as surely as the pneumonia did. If I'd cared less about building a fortune and more about keeping my family together—" "You were 16 years old," Delilah interrupted firmly. "You did what you thought was best with the information and resources you had. That's not failure, that's being human in an impossible situation." Beau stared down at their joined hands, his expression unreadable. "You're very kind, Mrs. Monroe, perhaps too kind, and you're very generous, Mr. Langston, perhaps more generous than you realize." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. Finally, Beau spoke again, his voice tentative. "Would you allow me to help more directly? Not just with supplies, but with the actual work. I have resources that could make your task easier, connections that might be useful." Delilah felt hope bloom in her chest, not just for the practical assistance he could provide, but for the chance to know this complicated man better. "I would welcome your help, Beau. The children would too." As they finished their coffee and prepared to leave, Delilah realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. The mysterious benefactor had become a partner. The distant rancher had revealed himself to be a man carrying old wounds that perhaps with time and trust might finally heal. And for the first time since James's death, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow, for reasons that had nothing to do with her mission and everything to do with the man walking beside her into the fading afternoon light. The transformation in Delilah's work began immediately after Beau's decision to help openly. What had been a solitary mission sustained by determination and hope became a coordinated effort that touched every corner of Silver Hollow. Beau's involvement brought not just resources, but legitimacy that opened doors previously closed to a pregnant widow working alone. Within days of their conversation, he had arranged for Henderson's general store to stock higher quality fabrics at reduced prices, with the difference quietly covered by his own account. He organized a delivery system that brought supplies directly to the orphanage, saving Delilah the increasingly difficult trek up the hillside as her pregnancy advanced. Most importantly, he began visiting the orphanage himself, bringing a calm authority that impressed even skeptical matron Crenshaw. "Miss Langston understands the practical needs of an institution," the matron confided to Delilah after Beau's third visit. "He's already arranged for firewood deliveries and promised to repair the building's heating system before the worst winter weather arrives." Delilah watched from across the room as Beau knelt beside Tommy, examining the boy's latest carving with the serious attention that children craved from adults. The sight stirred something warm in her chest that she was beginning to recognize as more than simple gratitude. "He's good with them," she observed. "Better than I expected," Matron Crenshaw admitted. "Mr. Langston has always kept to himself, avoided entanglements with the town's problems, but with these children, he's different, patient, present." The guarded man Delilah had met at Henderson's store was not the same person who spent his afternoons teaching David how to whittle wood shavings or listening to Sarah recite her poems. With the children, Beau's careful composure relaxed into something warmer, more natural. It was as if their uncomplicated acceptance allowed him to remember who he'd been before grief and guilt had shaped him into someone perpetually holding himself apart. The children, for their part, had accepted Beau's presence with the adaptability that was their greatest survival skill. They called him Mr. Beau and competed for his attention during his visits, eager to show off their progress on various projects. Tommy had carved him a small wooden star as a thank you gift, and Sarah had composed a poem about the kind man who brings warm things. Little Peter, now the proud owner of his green coat with animal buttons, had taken to following Beau around the orphanage like a devoted puppy, but it was Catherine who surprised everyone by forming the deepest connection with their new benefactor. The 12-year-old who mothered the younger children recognized something in Beau that the others missed, a loneliness that matched her own, a careful distance that spoke of old pain. Mr. Beau lost someone too, she told Delilah one afternoon as they worked together on the finishing touches for 16-year-old Samuel's coat. I can tell, he gets the same look in his eyes that I get when I think about my mama. Delilah glanced up from her stitching, struck by the child's perceptiveness. What makes you think that? He watches us like he's remembering something sad, but also like he's trying to make something right. Catherine's young face was serious beyond her years. People who haven't lost anyone don't understand how careful you have to be with love, how precious it is. The observation was so mature, so achingly accurate, that Delilah had to pause in her work to steady herself. These children, shaped by loss and abandonment, understood emotional complexity that many adults never grasped. Catherine had identified the core of Beau's struggle, his fear that caring would lead to loss, but his desperate need to find meaning in caring anyway. As January arrived with bitter cold and heavy snows, the urgency of completing the remaining coats intensified. Delilah had finished 18 of the 23, with 5 more in various stages of completion. Her pregnancy was making the work increasingly difficult. Her back ached constantly, her fingers were stiff from the cold, and she tired more easily each day. But she pushed on, driven by the approaching winter storms and her own determination to see the mission completed. It was during one of these intense work sessions that the town council's opposition finally came to a head. Delilah was at the orphanage, fitting 15-year-old Margaret for her burgundy wool coat, when Councilman Rogers arrived with 2 other men. Their faces were grim, their bearing official and unfriendly. "Matron Crenshaw," Rogers announced without preamble, "we need to discuss the future of this institution." The matron's face went pale. "Gentlemen, if this is about the monthly reports, this is about proper procedures and territorial regulations," Rogers interrupted, his gaze sweeping over the children who had gathered nervously around Delilah. "There have been complaints about unauthorized persons spending excessive time on these premises, conducting activities that fall outside approved institutional guidelines." Delilah felt cold certainty settle in her stomach. "Are you referring to me, Mr. Rogers?" "I'm referring to anyone who thinks they can circumvent proper authority and established procedures." His thin lips curved in what might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "This orphanage operates under territorial oversight, Mrs. Monroe. Private charitable activities require official approval, which I'm told you have never sought." "The children needed warm clothing," Delilah said evenly, though her heart was racing. "I saw a need and tried to help. Your motivations are irrelevant. What matters is that you've been conducting unauthorized activities that may compromise the institution's standing with territorial authorities. Effective immediately, these activities must cease." The silence that followed was broken by Tommy's small voice. "You mean Mrs. Monroe can't come anymore?" Roger's expression didn't soften as he looked down at the boy. "I mean that proper procedures must be followed. If Mrs. Monroe wishes to continue charitable work, she must apply through appropriate channels and receive official approval." "How long does that process take?" Delilah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Several months, typically. Perhaps longer during winter, when territorial offices operate on reduced schedules. Several months. The children would freeze before any official approval came through. Rogers knew this, counted on it. His goal wasn't to ensure proper procedures, it was to end her work entirely. "There is another solution," Rogers continued, his tone suggesting he'd been building to this moment. "The territorial government has been considering relocating these children to the established facility in Denver. Larger institutions are more efficiently managed, better equipped to handle the complexities of caring for so many children." Matron Crenshaw gasped. "You're talking about closing the orphanage. I'm talking about ensuring these children receive proper care from qualified professionals." Roger's gaze swept over the room again, taking in the bright coats, the carved buttons, the obvious affection between the children and their caregivers. Sentimental attachments are not in their best interests. It was then that Beau arrived. Delilah heard his footsteps on the porch before the door opened, but nothing could have prepared her for the transformation in his demeanor when he took in the scene before him. The careful courtesy he'd maintained during their recent interactions vanished, replaced by an authority that filled the room like cold steel. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, removing his hat and hanging it on the peg by the door. "I wasn't expecting a town council meeting today." Rogers straightened, clearly uncomfortable with Beau's unexpected presence. "Mr. Langston, we were just discussing administrative matters with Matron Crenshaw. Administrative matters that involve shutting down the orphanage and shipping these children to Denver." Beau's tone remained conversational, but there was something underneath it that made even confident Rogers take a step backward. "How did you? That is, we're simply exploring all options for ensuring proper care." "I see." Beau moved further into the room, and Delilah noticed that the children automatically moved closer to him, seeking the protection his presence offered. "And have you explored the option of supporting the excellent work already being done here?" "Mr. Langston, with respect, this institution lacks proper funding, adequate facilities, and qualified oversight. These children deserve better." "You're absolutely right," Beau agreed, and Delilah felt her heart sink. "They deserve much better than the neglect they've endured under current territorial oversight, which is why I'm prepared to take personal responsibility for ensuring they receive it." The silence that followed was electric with possibility and threat. Roger's face cycled through confusion, calculation, and growing alarm as he realized that Beau Langston, wealthy, influential, politically connected Beau Langston, was not going to be the ally he'd expected. "What exactly are you proposing?" Rogers asked carefully. Beau smiled, and it was not a friendly expression. "I'm proposing that Silver Hollow keep its orphanage, properly funded and administered. I'm proposing that Mrs. Monroe continue her valuable work without harassment or bureaucratic interference. And I'm proposing that anyone who disagrees with these arrangements take up their concerns with me directly." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. In a territory where Beau Langston's business interests touched nearly every major enterprise, his opposition could destroy careers and ruin livelihoods. Rogers understood this immediately, and his bluster deflated like a punctured balloon. "Of course, if you're willing to take responsibility for proper oversight," he began weakly. "I am," Beau said firmly, "completely and permanently." As the council members departed in defeated silence, Delilah found herself staring at Beau with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. In the space of 5 minutes, he'd not only saved her mission but committed himself to the orphanage's future in a way that would bind him to these children and to her indefinitely. "Thank you," she said quietly, aware that the words were completely inadequate. Beau looked around the room at the children's faces, hopeful, relieved, trusting, and something in his expression suggested he was as surprised by his commitment as everyone else. "Don't thank me yet," he said softly. "Now the real work begins." 3 days after Beau's confrontation with the town council, Delilah was putting the finishing touches on 17-year-old Samuel's dark blue coat when Matron Crenshaw approached her with an envelope bearing official territorial seals. "This came for you today," the matron said, her voice carefully neutral, "delivered by territorial courier." Delilah set down her needle, a cold premonition settling in her stomach. Official correspondence was rarely good news for someone in her position. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers and unfolded the heavy paper within. What she read made the world tilt sideways. The document was a property deed, officially transferring ownership of the land beneath the Silver Hollow home for foundlings to one Delilah Grace Monroe, effective immediately. But it wasn't the transfer itself that shocked her. It was the signature of the previous owner, relinquishing all claims to the property, Beauregard James Langston. She read the document 3 times before the implications fully settled in her mind. Beau hadn't just promised to take responsibility for the orphanage's future. He'd owned the land it sat on all along. Every conversation they'd had, every moment of growing trust and partnership had been built on a foundation of deception that changed everything she thought she knew about him. "Mrs. Monroe," Matron Crenshaw's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Is everything all right? You've gone quite pale." Delilah folded the document carefully, her hands moving automatically while her mind raced. "I need to see Mr. Langston immediately." She found him at his ranch, standing in the main corral watching his men work with the horses. The sight of him, tall, composed, completely at ease in his domain, suddenly struck her differently. This wasn't just a successful rancher who'd chosen to help with her charitable project. This was a man who'd owned the orphanage property for God knows how long, who could have solved every problem the children faced with a simple decision, yet had chosen instead to watch her struggle, to test her commitment, to play elaborate games with anonymous gifts while children shivered in inadequate clothing. "Delilah," he said, turning with a smile that faded quickly when he saw her expression, "what's wrong?" She held up the deed without speaking, watching as understanding and something that might have been relief crossed his features. "Ah," he said quietly, "you received the transfer papers." "Ah." Delilah's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. "That's all you have to say? Ah." Beau gestured toward his house. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "Oh, I think we're well past the point of private discussions, don't you, considering how much you've already kept private?" But she followed him toward the house, her anger building with each step. In his study, surrounded by leather-bound books and mahogany furniture that spoke of wealth and power, Delilah finally understood the full scope of what had been happening. Maps on the walls showed property holdings that extended far beyond what she'd imagined. A desk covered with official documents suggested business interests that reached into every aspect of territorial commerce. Beau Langston wasn't just successful, he was one of the most powerful men in the territory. "How long?" she asked, her voice deadly quiet. "How long what? How long have you owned the orphanage land?" Beau was silent for a long moment, and she could see him weighing how much truth to reveal. 12 years. 12 years. Delilah sank into a chair, the weight of betrayal settling over her like a physical burden. "You've owned that property for 12 years, watched those children live in poverty and neglect, and did nothing. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple." Her control finally snapped. "You could have repaired the building any time in the past 12 years. You could have ensured adequate funding, proper clothing, decent food. Instead, you let them suffer while you, waited to see if someone else would care enough to help." Beau's face had gone carefully blank, the warm man she'd come to know disappearing behind the mask of control she now recognized as his default protection. "You don't understand the complexities involved. Then explain them to me. Explain how a man who claims to care about children because of his own tragic loss could own the land those children live on and do nothing to help them for over a decade." "I bought the property to prevent it from being sold to mining interests," Beau said stiffly. "The previous owner was in debt and planned to evict the orphanage to make way for copper extraction. I purchased it to ensure the children wouldn't be displaced." "How noble of you." And then I watched. The admission hung in the air between them, and Delilah saw something crack in Beau's composed facade. When he continued, his voice was rougher, more honest than she'd ever heard it. "I told myself I was being practical. The territorial government was providing basic support. The children were housed and fed. I convinced myself that was enough, that doing more would be complicated." "Complicated how?" Beau moved to the window, staring out at his perfectly maintained ranch. "Because getting involved would mean caring about the outcome, and caring about children who could be taken away, who could die despite my best efforts, who could disappoint me or leave me or break my heart the way Emma did. That was a risk I wasn't prepared to take." The raw pain in his voice should have softened her anger, but instead it sharpened it. "So you let them suffer to protect yourself from potential heartbreak?" "Yes." The simple admission was devastating in its honesty. "Until you arrived and made that choice impossible." "What do you mean?" Beau turned back to face her, and she saw a vulnerability in his expression that took her breath away. "Watching you pour yourself into caring for those children, seeing their transformation under your attention, witnessing the way love can change everything, it destroyed every rationalization I'd built over 12 years. You made me see what I'd been too cowardly to see before. So the anonymous gifts, the careful distance, the elaborate pretense of discovering my work by accident, all of that was what? A test, a bridge," Beau said quietly. "A way to ease myself into caring without having to admit I'd been failing at it for years. A way to help without acknowledging how much help I should have been providing all along." Delilah stood abruptly, pacing to the opposite side of the room as if distance could help her process what she was hearing. "Do you have any idea how that makes me feel? To know that everything I've been struggling to accomplish single-handedly was within your power to provide from the beginning? Delilah, those children have been living in poverty on your land for 12 years, Beau. 12 years of inadequate clothing, insufficient heating, substandard food, all while you watched from your comfortable house and told yourself it wasn't your responsibility." "You're right," he said simply. "You're absolutely right, and I have no excuse that doesn't make me sound like exactly what I am, a coward who let fear of loss prevent him from preventing actual loss." The quiet acceptance in his voice stopped her pacing. She'd expected defenses, justifications, anything but this stark admission of failure. "When Councilman Rogers threatened to close the orphanage," Beau continued, "I realized I couldn't hide behind careful distance anymore. Those children needed an advocate, and you needed support, and I was the one person in Silver Hollow with the resources and influence to provide both. So you decided to transfer the property to me. I decided to put the power where it belongs, with someone who's proven she'll use it in the children's best interests, not with someone who's spent 12 years proving he won't." Delilah stared at him, trying to reconcile the man who'd spent the last month working beside her, earning the children's trust and her own growing affection, with the man who'd spent 12 years as an indifferent landlord to children in need. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she said finally.
I thought I was getting to know you, thought I understood who you were, but this changes everything. It doesn't change how I feel about you, Beau said quietly. The words hit her like a physical blow. How you feel about me? I'm in love with you, Delilah. I've been falling in love with you since the first day I watched you fit a coat on a child in the snow. Your kindness, your determination, your absolute refusal to accept that those children deserved anything less than dignity and care. It awakened something in me that I thought I'd buried with Emma. Delilah felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of frustration and betrayal, not joy. You can't tell me you love me in the same breath that you admit to 12 years of neglecting children who needed your help. I'm not asking you to forgive 12 years of cowardice. I'm asking you to believe that you've changed me, that watching you has taught me what courage actually looks like. And what if I can't? What if knowing this destroys whatever trust we'd built? Beau's face went very still. Then I'll live with that consequence, just as I've lived with all the others. But the children won't suffer for my failures anymore. The property is yours now, free and clear. Use it however you think best. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall again, and Delilah thought of the orphanage where 5 children still waited for coats, where 23 lives hung in the balance of decisions made by adults who had the power to help or harm.
I need time to think, she said finally.
Of course, and I need to finish the remaining coats. The children's needs come first, regardless of this. Absolutely. She moved toward the door, then paused. Beau, why transfer the property to me? Why not just take proper responsibility yourself? His smile was sad and self-aware. Because you've proven you'll always put the children first, even when it costs you everything. I've proven the opposite. Those children deserve better than my track record suggests I can provide. As Delilah rode back to town through the falling snow, the deed to 20 acres of prime territorial land folded carefully in her coat pocket. She felt the weight of responsibility and betrayal in equal measure. She owned the orphanage now, which meant 23 children's futures rested entirely in her hands. But the man she'd been falling in love with had revealed himself to be someone she wasn't sure she could trust with her heart. The remaining coats would be finished, the children would be cared for. But whether Beau Langston would have a place in their future or hers remained a question that only time and a great deal of soul-searching could answer. The week following Delilah's confrontation with Beau passed in a blur of furious productivity and emotional turmoil. She threw herself into completing the final 5 coats with an intensity that worried Mrs. Henley and left her fingers raw from constant stitching. The work became a refuge from the confusion in her heart. When she was focused on Samuel's buttonholes or Catherine's hem, she didn't have to think about grey eyes that had held secrets, or the way her entire understanding of the past month had been shattered by a simple property deed. The children sensed the tension immediately. They were too accustomed to reading adult moods for survival to miss the careful distance Delilah now maintained from their benefactor, or the way Mr. Beau's visits became shorter and more formal. Tommy, with the perceptiveness that had helped him survive 8 years of instability, was the first to ask directly, "Did Mr. Beau do something wrong?" He asked one afternoon as Delilah fitted him for new winter boots that had mysteriously appeared at the orphanage, another anonymous gift that now felt more like evidence of ongoing manipulation. "Why would you think that?" Delilah replied, focusing intently on the bootlaces to avoid meeting the boy's knowing eyes. "Because you don't smile when he comes anymore, and he looks sad when he thinks nobody's watching." Tommy's voice held the weary wisdom of a child who'd learned that adult relationships were fragile things that could shatter without warning. "Are you going to leave us too?" The question hit Delilah like a physical blow. In her anger and hurt over Beau's deception, she hadn't considered how her emotional withdrawal might appear to children who'd been abandoned before. To them, the growing distance between the 2 adults who'd become central to their world must seem like the prelude to another devastating loss. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, kneeling beside Tommy's chair despite the awkwardness of her expanding belly. "I'm not going anywhere. This is about grown-up problems that have nothing to do with you children. But Mr. Beau might leave?" Delilah hesitated, not wanting to lie but unsure how to explain the complex emotions she was struggling with herself. "Mr. Beau will always care about what happens to you. That won't change, no matter what." It was a careful answer that avoided the real question, and Tommy's expression suggested he knew it. But he nodded and allowed her to finish fitting his boots, accepting her reassurance with the resignation of a child who'd learned that adult promises were often qualified by circumstances beyond his control. The conversation haunted Delilah for the rest of the day. That evening, as she worked on Margaret's burgundy coat by lamplight, she found herself thinking about the children's perspective on recent events. To them, Mr. Beau wasn't a man who'd spent 12 years in emotional cowardice. He was the adult who'd appeared when they needed him, who'd listened to their stories and admired their carvings, who'd stood up to the town council when their very existence was threatened. The revelation of his property ownership, devastating as it was to her trust, didn't change what he'd actually done for the children in recent weeks. The firewood that kept them warm, the improved meals, the sense of security that came from knowing powerful adults were invested in their welfare, all of that remained real, regardless of his motivations or past failures. But could she separate her feelings about his deception from her growing love for the man she'd thought she was getting to know? Could she trust someone who'd hidden such fundamental truths about his relationship to the children they both claimed to care about? These questions became more urgent 3 days later when winter arrived with devastating suddenness. Delilah woke on Thursday morning to the sound of wind howling around the boarding house with unusual ferocity. When she looked out her window, she couldn't see across the street through the wall of white that filled the air. Snow was falling so heavily it seemed solid, and the wind was driving it horizontally with a force that made the building creak and shudder. Mrs. Henley appeared at her door with breakfast and a grim expression. Doc Henderson says this is the worst storm he's seen in 20 years. Temperatures dropped 30 degrees since yesterday, and it's still falling. Delilah's first thought was for the orphanage. Despite Beau's improvements to the heating system, the old building had never been designed to withstand truly severe weather. She tried to calculate how much firewood they had stored, whether the recent repairs would hold against such brutal conditions. "I need to get to the children," she said, already reaching for her heaviest shawl. "Absolutely not." Mrs. Henley's voice was firm. "The road up that hill is impassable in this weather, and you're 7 months pregnant. You'll freeze to death before you make it halfway." Delilah knew the older woman was right, but the knowledge did nothing to ease her anxiety. She spent the morning at her window, trying to see through the storm toward the hillside where 23 children were riding out the worst blizzard in decades. By afternoon, her worry had escalated to genuine fear. That's when the labor pains began. The first contraction hit without warning, a sharp, breathtaking pain that doubled her over and sent her breakfast plate crashing to the floor. Miss Henley was beside her instantly, helping her to the bed with the efficiency of a woman who'd assisted at enough births to recognize the signs. "How far apart?" she asked, settling Delilah as comfortably as possible. "That was the first." Delilah gasped as another contraction seized her, stronger than the first, and definitely too soon. "Mrs. Henley, the baby isn't due for 6 weeks. Babies don't always follow schedules, especially when their mothers are under stress." The older woman's voice was calm, but Delilah could see concern in her eyes. "I'm going to send word to Doc Henderson, though I doubt he can get here in this storm." As if summoned by their conversation, another voice called from downstairs. "Mrs. Henley, is everything all right? I saw the light and thought I should check." "Beau," Delilah whispered, recognizing the voice even through her pain. Mrs. Henley hurried to the window, peering down at the figure barely visible through the storm. "Mr. Langston, come up immediately. Mrs. Monroe is in labor." The next few minutes passed in a blur of urgent activity. Beau appeared in her doorway, his coat and hat white with snow, his face etched with concern that seemed to cut through all the careful distance they'd maintained since their confrontation. "How long has this been going on?" he asked Mrs. Henley, but his eyes never left Delilah's face. "Just started, but the pains are already close together, and the baby's not due for weeks." Another contraction gripped Delilah, stronger than the previous ones, and she couldn't suppress a cry of pain and fear. Beau was beside her instantly, taking her hand without asking permission. "Breathe through it," he said quietly. "Just breathe." "The children," she gasped as the pain subsided. "The orphanage in this storm. I've already checked on them," Beau said, squeezing her hand gently. "Before I came here. The building is secure, they have plenty of firewood and food, and Miguel is staying with them until the storm passes." Relief flooded through her, almost as overwhelming as the physical pain. "They're safe. They're safe. Tommy and Catherine are helping keep the younger ones calm, and they're all wearing their new coats inside for extra warmth. They're worried about you, but they're safe." Mrs. Henley returned with armloads of clean linens and hot water. "Doc Henderson can't get through in this weather, but his wife sent word that she's delivered plenty of babies. She'll come if the storm breaks." "And if it doesn't?" Delilah asked, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. "Then we'll manage," Beau said firmly. "Mrs. Henley has experience, and I've helped with difficult births on the ranch. You're not alone in this." As the storm raged outside and the contractions grew stronger, Delilah found herself clinging to Beau's hand, despite all the unresolved anger between them. This wasn't the time for recriminations or demands for explanations. Her baby was coming too early, in the middle of the worst blizzard in decades, and she needed all the support she could get. But even as she accepted his help, part of her mind was calculating distances and timing. If the storm didn't break soon, if complications arose, if the baby needed medical care that couldn't be provided in a boarding house room during a blizzard, the children at the orphanage weren't the only ones whose lives hung in the balance tonight. "Mrs. Monroe," Mrs. Henley said gently, "I need to examine you to see how far along things are." Delilah nodded, trying to prepare herself for whatever news might come. But as another contraction built to a crescendo that left her breathless and shaking, she realized that, ready or not, her baby was determined to enter the world tonight. Outside, the wind howled with increasing fury, and the snow continued to fall as if winter was determined to test every soul in Silver Hollow. In the orphanage, 23 children huddled together for warmth, trusting that the adults who'd promised to care for them would somehow see them through the storm. And in a small room above the boarding house, 3 adults prepared to bring new life into a world where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers and the courage to love despite the risk of loss. The worst night in Silver Hollow's recent memory was about to become the most transformative, though none of them could know it yet. All they could do was hold on to each other and hope that morning would bring not just the end of the storm, but the beginning of something better for all of them. The hours that followed blurred together in a haze of pain and determination. Delilah's labor progressed with frightening speed, each contraction stronger than the last, while outside the storm showed no signs of abating. Mrs. Henley moved between the bed and the window, her experienced hands providing comfort and guidance, while her worried glances toward the street revealed her growing concern about the isolation they faced. "The contractions are less than 3 minutes apart now," she told Beau quietly during a brief respite when Delilah had dozed between pains. "This baby isn't waiting for doctors or proper conditions. It's coming tonight." Beau nodded grimly, understanding the gravity of their situation. Premature births were dangerous under the best of circumstances, but here in a boarding house room during a blizzard, with no medical equipment and no way to get help if complications arose, they were completely on their own. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. "Keep her calm, keep her focused, and pray this little one is stronger than its early arrival suggests." When the next contraction hit, Delilah's grip on Beau's hand was so tight he wondered if she might break bones, but he held on, murmuring encouragement and trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. "I can't do this," Delilah gasped as the pain subsided. "It's too soon, too dangerous. What if—" "You can do this," Beau interrupted firmly. "You're the strongest person I know. You've been fighting for everyone else for months. Now fight for yourself and your baby. But if something goes wrong, nothing is going wrong. This baby wants to meet its mother, wants to be part of the family you're building. It's just impatient like someone else I know." Despite her pain, Delilah managed a weak smile at his attempt at humor, but as another contraction began building, her expression grew serious again. "Beau, if something happens to me, nothing will happen to you. If something does," she insisted, her voice gaining strength despite the approaching pain, "promise me you'll take care of the children. Not just financially, but really take care of them. Be present, be what they need." The contraction hit before he could answer, and he watched her face transform with the effort of managing pain that seemed beyond human endurance. When it passed, leaving her pale and trembling, he leaned closer. "I promise," he said quietly, "but you're going to be fine, and you're going to take care of them yourself for many years to come." Mrs. Henley appeared beside them with fresh linens and a basin of warm water. "I can see the baby's head," she announced, her voice mixing excitement with professional concern. "This is happening now, Mrs. Monroe. On the next contraction, I need you to push." What followed tested every reserve of strength and courage Delilah possessed. The pain was beyond anything she'd imagined, but underneath it was a fierce determination to bring her child safely into the world. Beau's steady presence became her anchor, his voice cutting through the haze of effort and exhaustion. "That's it," Mrs. Henley encouraged. "One more push and we'll have the head free." Delilah bore down with everything she had, and suddenly the pressure shifted. She heard Mrs. Henley's sharp intake of breath, followed by urgent movements around the bed. "What's wrong?" Beau asked, his voice tight with alarm. "The cord is around the baby's neck," Mrs. Henley said, her hands working quickly. "I need to— There. Got it." In the lamplight, Delilah could see the older woman's face, etched with concentration, as she carefully maneuvered to free the baby from the dangerous tangle. The seconds stretched endlessly, filled only with the sound of the storm outside and her own labored breathing. "All right," Mrs. Henley said finally. "One more contraction and we should have your baby." The final push seemed to draw on strength Delilah didn't know she possessed. She felt something fundamental shift, a sensation of completion and release, and then Mrs. Henley was lifting a small, still form into the lamplight. For a heart-stopping moment, there was only silence. The baby lay motionless in Mrs. Henley's hands, too small and too quiet, and Delilah felt terror unlike anything she'd ever experienced. "Why isn't it crying?" she whispered. Mrs. Henley was already working, clearing the baby's mouth and nose, rubbing the tiny chest with practiced efficiency. "Come on, little one," she murmured. "Take a breath for us." Beau's hand tightened on Delilah's, and she could feel his tension matching her own. The storm seemed to pause, as if even the wind was waiting to hear the sound they all needed. Then, thin and reedy but undeniably alive, came the cry they'd been praying for. "There we are," Mrs. Henley said with deep satisfaction, wrapping the baby in warm blankets. Her daughter, Mrs. Monroe, small but strong. Delilah felt tears streaming down her face as Mrs. Henley placed the tiny bundle in her arms. The baby was indeed small, frighteningly so, but her eyes were open and alert, and her grip on Delilah's finger was surprisingly firm. "Hello, little one," Delilah whispered. "You certainly know how to make an entrance." The baby's hair was dark like her father's had been, but her eyes held depths that reminded Delilah of storm clouds and hidden kindness. As she studied her daughter's face, she was struck by how perfect she was despite her early arrival, how completely she fit in the space between Delilah's heart and arms. "She's beautiful," Beau said softly, and when Delilah looked up, she saw wonder in his expression that matched her own. "What will you call her?" Delilah considered the question, thinking about this child who'd chosen to enter the world during the worst storm in memory, who'd survived a dangerous birth through sheer determination. Outside, the wind was finally beginning to quiet, and the first hints of dawn were visible through the snow-laden clouds. "Grace," she said finally. "Grace Monroe. Because sometimes grace comes exactly when we need it most, even if we don't recognize it at first." As she spoke, the baby's eyes focused on her face with startling intensity, as if she understood the significance of her name and the circumstances of her birth. In that moment, holding her daughter while the storm finally broke around them, Delilah felt something shift in her understanding of what family meant, what love required, and what kind of future might be possible for all of them. As dawn broke over Silver Hollow, the storm's fury finally began to subside, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice. But inside the boarding house, a different kind of transformation was taking place. Baby Grace, despite her premature arrival, seemed determined to thrive, nursing eagerly and sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. The immediate crisis had passed, but new challenges emerged with the morning light. Doc Henderson arrived as soon as the roads became passable, his examination confirming what they all hoped, that despite her early arrival, Grace appeared healthy and strong. 6 pounds is small for a full-term baby, but perfectly respectable for someone who arrived 6 weeks ahead of schedule, he announced, closing his medical bag with satisfaction. "Keep her warm, make sure she's feeding well, and she should do just fine." But as relief over Grace's condition settled in, urgent news arrived with Miguel Santos, who fought through the remaining snowdrifts to reach the boarding house. "The orphanage," he said without preamble, his weathered face grim with concern. "The heating system failed during the night. We managed to keep the children warm until now, but the firewood is running low, and the main chimney has damage that's letting in snow and wind." Delilah felt her heart clench with fear. "Are the children all right?" "Cold and scared, but alive. We moved them all into the main room and built up the fireplace there, but it's not enough. If we can't get more heat into that building soon..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood the implications. 23 children could freeze to death while adults debated logistics and pointed fingers. "We need to move them," Beau said immediately. "Bring them here, to my ranch. The house is large enough, and we have adequate heating and supplies." "In this weather?" Mrs. Henley asked. "Some of those children are very young and the roads are still dangerous." "More dangerous than leaving them in a building without heat," Beau replied grimly. "Miguel, how many can we safely transport in one trip? With the big sleigh and extra blankets, maybe 8 or 10 at a time. But it'll take multiple trips, and we'll need to move fast." Delilah struggled to sit up, despite Mrs. Henley's protests. "I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not," Beau said firmly. "You gave birth 6 hours ago in the middle of a blizzard. You're staying here with Grace. Those children are my responsibility." "They're our responsibility," Beau corrected, his voice gentle but implacable. "And right now your responsibility is to recover and care for your daughter. Let me handle this." The word "our" hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither had time to examine fully.
But in that moment, facing a crisis that threatened the children they both cared about, the property deeds and past deceptions seemed less important than immediate action. "Take Tommy and Catherine first," Delilah said, accepting the necessity of staying behind. "They can help keep the younger ones calm during the transition." Beau nodded, already reaching for his coat. "Miguel, get the sleigh ready. Mrs. Henley, can you prepare space here for the children who might need medical attention?" "Of course, and I'll send word to other families in town. Some of them might be willing to take a child or two temporarily." As the men prepared to leave, Delilah caught Beau's arm. "Be careful," she said quietly, "and tell the children that Grace and I are fine, that we're thinking of them." "I will." He hesitated, then leaned down to brush a gentle kiss across her forehead. "Rest. When I bring them back, they'll want to meet their newest sister." The hours that followed tested everyone's endurance and resolve. Beau and Miguel made 4 dangerous trips through the snow-covered mountains, each time bringing a group of frightened but resilient children to safety. The older children helped care for the younger ones, displaying the same remarkable strength and maturity that had sustained them through previous hardships. Tommy was in the second group, and he went immediately to Delilah's bedside when he arrived at the ranch. "Mrs. Monroe, are you all right? We were so worried when the storm came and you didn't visit." "I'm perfectly fine, sweetheart," Delilah assured him, adjusting Grace's blanket so he could see her better. "And I have someone I'd like you to meet. This is Grace." Tommy's eyes widened as he studied the sleeping baby. "She's so small. Is she going to be okay?" "She's going to be just fine, strong like her big brothers and sisters at the orphanage." Catherine arrived with the third group, immediately taking charge of organizing the younger children and helping them adjust to their temporary home. Her natural leadership abilities shone as she comforted scared toddlers and helped distribute the warm clothes and hot food that Beau's household staff provided. "Mr. Beau says we can stay as long as we need to," she told Delilah during a quiet moment. "He's going to rebuild the orphanage heating system and make other improvements too. He says it's going to be the finest children's home in the territory." By evening, all 23 children were safe and warm in Beau's house, which had been transformed into a temporary refuge filled with the sounds of young voices and the organized chaos of institutional care transplanted to a domestic setting. The children adapted with the flexibility that was their greatest survival skill, but Delilah could see the strain in their faces, the uncertainty about what these changes might mean for their future. As night fell and the children were settled for sleep in bedrooms and parlors throughout the house, Beau found Delilah in the main bedroom where she was nursing Grace by the firelight. "How are they really doing?" she asked quietly. "Better than I expected. Scared but resilient." Tommy asked if this means they'll have to leave Silver Hollow, and Catherine wanted to know if you're still going to be their friend. "What did you tell them?" "That some things are going to change, but the important things, the fact that they're loved and wanted and cared for, those things won't change at all." Delilah looked up at him, seeing exhaustion in his face but also something else, a sense of purpose and determination that reminded her of the man she'd been falling in love with before the revelation about the property. "Thank you," she said simply, "for saving them, for being there when they needed you, for being there when you needed me too, I hope." Their eyes met across the lamplight, and Delilah felt the walls she'd built around her heart over the past week beginning to crack. The man who'd spent the day risking his life to save 23 children, who'd opened his home without question and committed his resources to their future, was the same man whose past cowardice had hurt her so deeply. Perhaps Tommy had been right when he'd observed that people who'd lost things understood love differently. Perhaps understanding the cost of caring made it more precious, not less trustworthy. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "About everything. About what happens next." "When you're ready," Beau agreed. "All the time you need." Outside, Silver Hollow lay buried under snow that would take weeks to fully melt. But inside the warm house where 24 children now slept safely, the future was beginning to take shape, uncertain still, but built on a foundation of love that had been tested by crisis and found strong enough to hold them all.
3 months later, spring had returned to Silver Hollow with a gentleness that seemed to promise new beginnings. The snow had melted from all but the highest peaks, revealing a world washed clean and ready for fresh growth. In the valley below, construction was nearly complete on what would be the finest children's home in the Colorado Territory, a building designed not just for survival, but for the kind of childhood that fostered dreams and nurtured potential. Delilah stood at the window of what would soon be her office in the new facility, baby Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms. At 3 months old, Grace had not only caught up to her expected size but had become the undisputed darling of 23 older siblings who competed for the privilege of holding her, reading to her, and showing her their latest accomplishments. "The sign arrived this morning," Beau said, joining her at the window. In his arms was a wooden plaque that would soon hang beside the front door, its carved letters reading "Langston Monroe Home for Children" in elegant script. "It's beautiful," Delilah said, running her finger over Tommy's intricate carving work. The boy had insisted on creating the sign himself, spending weeks perfecting each letter until it met his exacting standards. He's become quite the craftsman. He's applied for an apprenticeship with the carpenter in town, Beau replied with pride. And Catherine has been accepted to the teaching college in Denver with a full scholarship. The changes in the children over the past 3 months had been remarkable, with the security of knowing they had a permanent home and adults who were genuinely invested in their futures. Each child had begun to bloom in ways that revealed hidden talents and long-suppressed dreams. Sarah was writing stories that the local newspaper wanted to publish. David had designed improvements to the building's foundation that impressed even experienced contractors. Little Peter had taught himself to read using picture books and determination, but perhaps the most significant change was in the man standing beside her. The guarded, solitary rancher who'd kept the world at arm's length had been replaced by someone who knew each child's favorite food, remembered their nightmares, and could settle disputes with the wisdom of a natural father. Watching Beau help 10-year-old Michael with his mathematics or listen gravely to 6-year-old Anna's elaborate theories about why flowers grew had convinced Delilah that people could indeed change when given sufficient reason. "There's something else," Beau said, his voice carrying a note of nervous anticipation that made her look at him more closely. "A letter from the territorial governor's office. They want to use our home as a model for other institutions throughout the region. Full funding, oversight support, the works." "That's wonderful news," Delilah said, though she sensed there was more to his announcement. "It means we'll be dealing with official visits, government inspectors, political attention. Things will be more complicated than just caring for 23 children in a small mountain town. Are you having second thoughts?" Beau was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving over the construction site where their shared dream was taking physical form. "No second thoughts about the children or the home. They deserve every opportunity we can provide, and if our success here can help other children elsewhere, then we have an obligation to share what we've learned." But he turned to face her fully, and she saw the vulnerability in his expression that she'd learned to recognize as a prelude to complete honesty. "But I am having thoughts about us, about what kind of partnership we have, what kind of future we're building together." Grace stirred in Delilah's arms, making the soft sounds that preceded waking. Delilah adjusted her hold, using the moment to steady herself for whatever Beau was about to say. "The property deed was never about charity or even guilt," he continued. "It was about recognizing that you were better suited to lead this mission than I was. But these past months, working together, seeing how we complement each other's strengths, I think we make a better team than either of us could be alone." "I think so too," Delilah admitted. "Then would you consider making it official? Not just the partnership for the children's sake, but a real marriage, a real family." Grace chose that moment to wake fully, opening eyes that had settled into a clear blue-gray that reminded Delilah of morning skies after storms. The baby looked up at both adults with the solemn attention she'd shown since birth, as if she understood the importance of this conversation. "Yes," Delilah said simply, and watched Beau's face transform with relief and joy. Just like that, no conditions or negotiations or discussions about the complexities involved. "Just like that," Delilah confirmed, shifting Grace so she could reach for Beau's hand. "Because some things are too important for complications. Love is one of them. Family is another." Through the window, they could see children playing in the construction area under the watchful eye of Miguel Santos, who'd appointed himself unofficial supervisor of both building progress and child safety. Tommy was showing some of the younger ones how to identify different types of wood, while Catherine organized a game that somehow combined education with entertainment. The scene was chaotic and joyful and utterly perfect in its normalcy. "When?" Beau asked, squeezing her hand gently. "Soon, but not too soon. I want all the children to be involved in planning it. This marriage isn't just about us, it's about creating something permanent for all of them. A wedding planned by 23 children should be interesting. It should be perfect," Delilah corrected. "Messy and loud and full of love and probably involving at least 17 different kinds of cake, but perfect." As if summoned by their conversation, Tommy appeared in the doorway, his face bright with excitement. "Mrs. Monroe, Mr. Beau, come see what we found." He was bouncing with barely contained energy. "In the old foundation, when we were clearing it out, we found a box of baby clothes. Old ones, but really beautiful, like someone saved them for something special." Delilah and Beau exchanged glances, both thinking of the generations of children who'd lived on this land, the hopes and dreams that had been planted here long before their own story began. "Show us," Delilah said, allowing Tommy to lead them outside into the warm spring afternoon. The box was indeed beautiful, filled with tiny garments, sewn with the same care and attention that Delilah had put into the orphans' coats. There were christening gowns and everyday dresses, small shirts and carefully knitted booties, all preserved by time and circumstance for this moment of discovery. "It's like the land wanted Grace to have them," Catherine observed with the mystical certainty of adolescence, like it was waiting for the right baby to come along. As Delilah lifted a delicate white dress from the box, she felt the weight of history and hope combined. The children gathered around her. Grace and Beau formed a circle that seemed to encompass all the love and loss and redemption that had brought them to this moment. "What do you think?" she asked Grace softly. Ready to be part of the biggest, most complicated, most wonderful family in Colorado, Grace's answer was a smile, her first real smile that seemed to illuminate not just her small face, but the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. In that smile was the future they were building together, uncertain in its details, but anchored by love strong enough to weather any storm. Above them, the sign for the Langston Monroe Home for Children waited to be installed, marking not an end but a beginning. And in the distance, Silver Hollow spread out in the afternoon sunshine, a town transformed by the simple truth that when people choose to care for the forgotten, everyone benefits. The pregnant woman who'd arrived with nothing but fabric scraps and determination had found something she'd never been looking for, a love large enough to encompass not just one man and one child, but an entire community of hearts that had learned to beat as one. And in finding that love, she'd given everyone around her the chance to discover their own capacity for grace.